In this video, you will learn how sentence combining can help make your writing more fluid, concise, and varied. Combining sentences is a way to improve the flow of your writing. If you've ever been told that your writing is a little choppy, or that it's a little wordy, that you have unnecessary repetition, then combining sentences is a way to help solve these problems. The basic idea is to take the information that is different or new in one of your sentences and add it into another sentence in the smoothest way possible. Sometimes this requires substantial restructuring, so it's important to think outside of the structure you've already created and to really step back and look at the information you're trying to convey and to figure out what the best possible way to convey that information is to make it as clear as possible to your reader. Let's look at a simple example. School begins next week. To prepare for school, I purchased and labeled all of my supplies. There's nothing really wrong with this, but we do have a little bit of unnecessary repetition. With school, school begins to prepare for school. So in order to eliminate that, I can combine these two sentences into one sentence. Begins next week is the new or different information in the first sentence. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to add it to the second sentence. I have to change it a little bit, notice, to prepare for the beginning of school next week. I purchased and labeled all of my supplies. That's often what happens as you're changing the form or part of speech of a word to make it fit into another sentence fluidly. Sometimes all you have to do is take a word that's in one sentence and insert it into the new sentence. I read many books over the summer. They were fiction. Fiction is the new information, so I'm just going to stick that into the first sentence. I read many fiction books over the summer. If the information in one of the sentences can be reduced to a phrase, then you can add that phrase to the other sentence. Make sure that when you're doing this, you're putting the phrase as close as possible to the word that it modifies so you can avoid creating other grammatical issues such as dangling or misplaced modifiers. Two of the books I read were young adult novels. They were by John Green. So what's the new information? By John Green. Here I can really simply just take that phrase and add it to the previous sentence. By John Green is modifying the word novels, so just sticking it on the end is actually the appropriate placement for that phrase. This one's a little bit more complicated. I have John Green's novels often feature protagonists with emotional, psychological, and even physical problems. The central conflict in these novels is typically centered around adolescent romance. This might not appear as being too choppy or repetitive, although there is some stuff we can weed out by combining the sentences. So let's take a look at a possibility. We could do this. Featuring protagonists with emotional, psychological, and even physical problems, John Green's novels are typically centered around adolescent romance. This is certainly not the only way to combine these sentences. This goes back to what I said a few minutes ago about thinking about the information you're trying to convey and the best possible way to do that. Often, you're making a decision about what you want to emphasize. So in the revision here, the main clause is what gets emphasized, the fact that the novels are centered around adolescent romance. If I wanted to emphasize the other sentence, then I would take the central conflict sentence and reduce that to a phrase. Maybe something along the lines of, typically centered around adolescent romance, comma, John Green's novels feature protagonists with emotional, psychological, and even physical problems. So there's more than one way to do it. You just want to make sure that the choice that you make is conveying the information as clearly as possible based on your intention as a writer. If the sentences have the same subject or the same verb, you can create a simple sentence that has a compound subject, a compound verb, or both. I enjoy reading young adult novels. I also enjoy reading detective fiction. It's a little choppy and repetitive. In fact, most of that second sentence is a repetition. So what I've underlined here is the repetitive part. So I'm going to take the new part, what's left, detective fiction, and I'm going to add it to the other sentence. I enjoy reading young adult novels and detective fiction. If the information in one of the sentences is less important than the information in the other, in other words, you want to emphasize the content of one sentence over another, then a really good option is to create a complex sentence, which is basically taking one of your sentences and turning it into a subordinate clause and attaching it to the other sentence, which remains an independent clause. Tana French is my favorite crime fiction author. Her novels are set in and around Dublin, Ireland. Again, nothing obviously repetitive or problematic about this, but if I'm trying to create variety or a more fluid rhythm in my sentences, I might do something like this. Tana French, whose novels are set in and around Dublin, Ireland, is my favorite crime fiction author. So again, just like in the previous example, whatever you turn into the subordinate clause gets de-emphasized. So in this revision, I wanted to emphasize that she was my favorite crime fiction author, but I could do the opposite. I could say Tana French, my favorite crime fiction author, writes novels that are set in and around Dublin, Ireland. So it's really a matter of what you want to emphasize and what you're trying to convey. It should also connect smoothly to the surrounding context of your sentences. So you want to think about that too when you're revising. All of these examples we're looking at in isolation, but most of the time you're going to be writing sentences that are in context of something else. So that's going to influence your decision as well. Here's another example. Her novels suggest an intimate knowledge of Dublin and its people. French was actually born in Vermont. So if I look at these sentences and I think about their relationship, it really looks like I want to set up a contrast. So what I'm going to do is create a subordinate clause with the use of the word although. Although her novels suggest an intimate knowledge of Dublin and its people, French was actually born in Vermont. Same idea here. I could flip the emphasis. Although French was born in Vermont, her novels suggest an intimate knowledge of Dublin and its people. Depends on what you want to emphasize. So here's a little bit of practice. As I've been saying the entire time, there's more than one possible way to revise each of these sentences. You want to make sure, though, that your revision is grammatically correct, clear, and concise. So here's where you pause the video, take a few minutes to try maybe a few different possible revisions for each of these sentences, and then restart the video to see what some of my suggestions are. Number 1, Tana French was born in Vermont. She also lived in Ireland, Italy, and Malawi. Lots of possibilities here. The one that I'm going to suggest is a subordinate clause. Although she was born in Vermont, Tana French also lived in Ireland, Italy, and Malawi. We want to be careful, though, if we think about context and going back to the sentence from a few slides ago where we said, although her novel suggests an intimate knowledge of Dublin and its people, Tana French was actually born in Vermont. We want to be careful that we're not repeating that structure. So if this is all part of one big paragraph, then I don't want to use the although structure again. It really depends on context. Number 2, she has written 7 novels so far. Each novel features a different protagonist. Here's one way to revise. So far, she has written 7 novels, each featuring a different protagonist. I want to point out here that I moved so far to the beginning because when I created the phrase each featuring, I needed it to be as close as possible to the word novels. So I moved the adverb phrase so far so that I could put the phrase right beside the word that it's modifying. Here's another possibility. Again, so far comes at the beginning. So far, she has written 7 novels that each feature a different protagonist. They sound slightly different. In the first example, we've created a phrase. In the second example, we've created a clause. Again, come back to context, read it out loud in the context of your own writing to see if your revision is the one that you want. And don't be afraid to try. Don't be afraid. Don't be lazy and stick with whatever you write first. Come back and try a few different possibilities so that you can land upon the one that sounds the best. Cassie Maddox is a character in the first novel. She becomes the protagonist in the second novel. Here's a possibility. We're going to create in a positive phrase. Cassie Maddox, a character in the first novel, becomes the protagonist in the second novel. I really like this option because it just gives us a little bit of information about Cassie Maddox being a character in the first novel, and then it emphasizes the second sentence. I actually like this second version better, just because I think it's even clearer about the relationship between those two ideas. After appearing as a character in the first novel, Cassie Maddox becomes the protagonist in the second novel. The meaning isn't so different, but the idea of after appearing, I think, helps lend an emphasis to the significance of the fact that she was in this novel and now she's the protagonist in the next one. 4, most of the protagonists have personal problems. These problems often connect to the cases they are solving. So here we have your pretty much basic repetition of words that we don't need. So to avoid that unnecessary repetition, I'm just going to make one sentence. Most of the protagonists have personal problems connected to the cases they are solving. So all I needed to do was take that one word from the first sentence, personal, and add that to the second sentence. Again, maybe I'm, becoming a broken record here, but the most important thing to do is read aloud your work and try a couple different possibilities, choosing the one that is clearest and most concise and that also provides the best rhythm and variety in the context of the writing piece as a whole.